Montana Territory, June 1881. The wind off the Bitterroot Mountains carried a dry heat down into the wide valley, stirring the dust on the trail long before the rider came into view. Florence Lark leaned against the weather-worn post of her porch, arms folded, jaw set. She knew that horse. Knew the man slouched in the saddle like the world owed him nothing and he asked even less of it. And she had not seen him in 6 years. The rider slowed as he approached the house, hat low over his brow, dark eyes unreadable. The bay beneath him tossed its head once, uneasy. "Florence did not move, Florence," he said, voice rough as gravel and just as familiar. She narrowed her eyes. "You should not be here, Ash Nolan." He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots solid on the earth. The moment stretched between them like a pulled thread. He looked older, broad shoulders still straight, but his face carried the weight of time. The scar on his jaw, the one he had not had when he left, caught the sun. "I know," he said. The screen door creaked open behind her. "Mama," came a small voice. Florence turned, softening as her son stepped out. "Is that someone from before?" "Lyle, go inside," she said gently. Lyle, 8 years old and brave in a way no child should have to be, looked between them. Then he nodded and went back in, the door clicking shut. Ash stared at the door. "You have a son." "I have two," Florence said, her tone cut sharp. "Lyle and Lee." Their father walked out before Lee could speak her first word. Ash's throat moved as he swallowed. "You married after I left." "No," she said. "You know better than that." Silence fell again. Nothing but the wind, the creak of the cottonwoods. Florence crossed her arms tighter. "Why are you back?" Ash looked at her, really looked. There was nothing soft in his face, just truth, just the years between them. "Because you're still here," her breath caught. She hated the way her chest pulled tight, the way her eyes stung. She turned from him, stepping off the porch and walking toward the barn. He followed, boots crunching slow behind her. "You do not get to say that," she said, not looking back. "You left. You were gone when I needed you. When Mama died, when the homestead nearly burned, when Lyle had the fever, you were gone." "I know," he said again. She turned on him, eyes full. "Then what are you doing here now?" "I was in Wyoming, working cattle. I heard you were still on this land." He paused. "I thought about you every day." Florence laughed bitterly. "And that brings you here now? What, you thought I would be waiting on a porch swing for you like nothing happened?" "I thought maybe you would still be Florence." She stared at him. "I am, but I am also a mother now. I am tired, and I do not have room for ghosts." He took off his hat, held it in both hands. "I am not a ghost, Florence. I came back because I cannot stop thinking about you, and I know I do not deserve anything, but I had to see you, to ask if maybe you would let me help." She blinked. "Help? With the ranch?" "With the kids, if you will allow it, with anything you need." "You think you can just ride in and be a part of their lives?" "No," he said, "but I can try. You always said a man ought to fix what he breaks. I broke this. I broke us, so I am here to fix it." Florence looked toward the house. "You do not even know them." "Then let me know them." For a moment she said nothing, then she looked down at her hands. "Lee is 5. She likes to sing to the chickens. Lyle reads better than most boys twice his age. He thinks men who leave are cowards." Ash winced. "You want to help?" "Fence line needs mending. South pastures full of gopher holes, and I need someone to ride into town tomorrow for sugar and flour." His eyes met hers. "I will ride at dawn." She nodded once. "You sleep in the barn." He nodded back. "Fair enough." She turned to walk away, then paused. "When did you get that scar?" "Texas. Drove a herd through Comanche land. Took a knife for a boy too young to be on the trail." "And why did you leave back then?" He hesitated. "Because I was scared. You loved me too much, and I thought I did not deserve it, but I know better now." Florence held his gaze for a long, long moment. Then she walked toward the house. That night, Ash lay on a cot in the barn, listening to the wind whistle through the slats. He could hear the faint creak of the house, the murmur of a child's voice, the soft tread of Florence's steps upstairs. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of hay and old wood. He was not sure if she would ever forgive him, but he was here. And he would not leave again. In the house, Florence stood by the window, watching the barn, her arms wrapped around her middle. She did not know if she could trust him. But something in her heart stirred something that had gone quiet a long time ago. She turned from the window. Tomorrow he would ride into town. Tomorrow he would fix the fence. And maybe, just maybe, she would let him try. The first light spread cold and silver across the ridgeline when Ash stepped out of the barn, saddle slung over one shoulder. The frost had lifted, but the earth still held its chill. He saddled the bay without speaking, and the horse stood quiet under his hands. The morning air smelled of pine bark and dew-wet earth. Florence was already at the pump, sleeves rolled to her elbows, filling a dented tin basin. Her hair was pinned back, a few loose strands sticking to her neck. She didn't look up when he approached, only handed him a folded list written in her careful, slanted hand. "Store opens around sunup," she said. "Tell Mr. Beale I'll settle up for the flour next month. Sugar's paid." He nodded, folding the note into his vest pocket. As he turned to go, she spoke again, quieter. "Lyle's been asking about you." Ash paused, hand resting on the saddle horn. "What you tell him? That you're helping with the work, that you'll be riding into town today, nothing more." "He looks like you," Ash said before he could stop himself. Florence's jaw tensed, but she didn't reply. She lifted the basin from the pump and carried it toward the house without another word. The ride to town was long enough for the sun to climb above the tree line. Ash kept to the trail, passing the rust-colored bluffs that marked the halfway point. A lone hawk circled overhead. He remembered this land like muscle memory, the bend in the creek, the cottonwood snag where he and Florence used to meet when her father still ran the place. By the time he reached town, the streets were stirring. A freight wagon rattled past the livery, and Miss O'Malley's boarding house had smoke curling from its chimney. He tied off the bay in front of Beale's General, stepping inside and nodding to the shopkeep. "Morning," Mr. Beale said, looking up from the ledger. "Didn't expect to see you back in these parts." "Just passing through," Ash replied. "Florence sent me for supplies." Beale handed over a sack of flour and a tin of sugar. "She holding up all right?" "She's managing." "She always does," Beale said, then lowered his voice. "Some of us wondered if you'd ever come back." Ash didn't answer. He paid for the sugar and slung the supplies over his shoulder. On the ride back, he saw smoke drifting from the hills to the east, someone burning brush, maybe. He kept his eyes on the trail, though his thoughts were with the boy who had asked about him, and the girl he hadn't yet met back at the homestead. Florence was in the garden, clearing out thistle from between the rows. Lyle sat cross-legged nearby, carving at a stick with a dull penknife. Ash handed over the goods without ceremony. She took them without thanks. "Lee's napping," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "Lyle, help me with the wash." The boy stood, then hesitated. "Can I ask him something first?" Florence looked to Ash, then gave a slight nod. Lyle stepped closer, squinting up at him. "Did you ever shoot a man?" Ash didn't flinch. "Once." "Why?" "He was hurting someone." Lyle considered this, then nodded. "Mama says men should protect people." "She's right." The boy studied him for a moment longer, then said, "You can help me feed the chickens later if you want." "I'd like that." Florence watched the exchange without speaking. When Lyle followed her inside, she lingered on the porch for a breath more. "You didn't lie to him," she said. "No," Ash replied. "I won't." She gave him a long look, then disappeared inside. That evening, Ash worked the south fence until night settled over the valley. The rails were dry rotted in places, and the posts leaned like tired men. He set them straight, one by one, until his back ached and sweat soaked through his shirt. By the time he washed his hands in the trough, the first stars had emerged. He didn't expect her to come out again, but she did. She stood by the porch, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, lantern in one hand. "You missed supper." "I wasn't hungry." "You will be by morning." She nodded to the porch step. "Sit a minute." He did. She set the lantern down between them, its light flickering across the boards. They didn't speak for a while. The crickets filled the silence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "You still walk like you did back then," she said at last. "Like you're expecting someone to shoot at you." "Sometimes I am." She looked out toward the darkened pasture. "You said you were scared, back then." I was. Are you still? Ash looked at the woman beside him, the hard lines of her face softened by lantern glow, the quiet weight in her voice. Yes, he said. But not of loving you, not anymore. She didn't respond. Just sat there, holding her shawl closed with one hand, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. When she finally rose, she didn't look at him. Wash up before you come in. You'll track dirt through the kitchen. Then she was gone, and Ash, for the first time in years, let himself hope. The next morning broke slow and gray, clouds hanging low over the peaks like they'd been poured from a ladle. Rain threatened but held, and the air had the smell of wet stone and pine needles. Florence stepped outside with a basket under her arm, her boots scuffing the damp porch. Ash was already in the field, sleeves rolled, digging out a fence post sunk crooked along the northern line. He didn't look up when she crossed the yard, but she could tell he heard her, the pause in his motion, the tilt of his head just slightly toward her. I'm taking Lee to visit the Bensons, she called to him. Their girl's been asking after her. Lyle's staying with Mrs. Kemper until I'm back. Ash leaned on the shovel, wiping his brow. You want me to keep on with the fencing, unless you've got another trade I don't know about. I was a half-decent carpenter for a spell down in Cheyenne, built a church porch that didn't collapse. She gave half a nod. Then the chicken coop could use your eye. Fox got in 2 nights ago. I'll see to it. Florence didn't linger. She hitched the wagon, settled Lee in beside her, and drove down the rutted path without another word. The girl hummed to herself, clutching a cloth rabbit worn near bald. Ash watched them go until the wagon disappeared into the trees. Then he dropped the shovel and headed for the coop. The damage was worse than he'd expected. 3 boards cracked, one corner post loose in the ground. He set to work with measured effort, pulling nails with the claw of his hammer and replacing what he could from the stack of scrap in the shed. The tools were rough, handles worn smooth from years of use, but they fit his hands better than most things had in a long while. By the time the sun broke through in patches, he was sawing a new crossbeam beneath the rafters. Lyle appeared then, kicking at a stone as he walked the edge of the yard. You ever teach a kid to whittle proper? The boy asked, not looking up. Ash set the saw down. Depends if the kid listens. I ain't carved anything that doesn't look like a stick with a hole in it. Then it's a start. Ash motioned to the stump near the coop. Go fetch your knife. Lyle returned a few minutes later with his blade and a hopeful kind of squint. Ash took a seat beside him, pulled a spare scrap from the pile, and showed him how to find the grain before drawing the knife. They didn't talk much. The sound of the blade against wood filled the air between them. After a while, Lyle asked, You ever have a pa? I did, Ash said, steady in his carving. He taught me how to saddle a horse before I could reach the stirrup. Died of a cough when I was 16. My pa died too, Lyle said, quiet. Ash didn't correct him. Later, Florence returned with a dusty wagon and a pink-faced Lee asleep against her shoulder. She didn't speak as Ash helped her lift the girl inside. When he stepped back, she lingered on the porch instead of going in. Something's shifted in Lyle, she said. He's quieter when he's thinking. That's new. Ash kept his hands in his pockets. He's got a good mind, just needs someone to let him use it. She looked at him then, more directly than she had since he came back. You sound like you want to stay. I do. You said you left because you didn't think you deserved me. That's true. And now, I still don't, he said. But I'm not running from that anymore. She was silent for a long moment, then stepped down from the porch and walked past him toward the coop. She ran her fingers along the new boards, testing the give in the post. Solid work, she said. Carpenter in Cheyenne taught me how to brace from the ground up. She turned to him. You planning on building anything else? That depends. On what? On if you'll let me. Florence looked out at the fields where the grass had started to green at the edges. Then she looked back at him. I might, she said. But it'll take more than fence posts and fox-proof chicken wire. Ash nodded once. Good, I plan to earn it. That night, after the children had gone quiet and the fields lay still under a pale moon, Florence stepped outside again. She didn't carry a lantern this time. Just her shawl and a tin cup of black coffee in her hands. Ash was sitting on the edge of the porch, arms resting on his knees. "There's a room upstairs," she said. "Used to be my father's, still has a bed in it." He looked up at her, not moving. "You'll find a spare quilt in the cedar chest," she added. "If you're planning to stay." He stood slowly, searching her face. "You sure?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I'm tired of deciding everything out of fear." He followed her inside, up the narrow steps that creaked beneath their weight. She opened the door to the small room, then left him there without a word. Ash stood in the center of it, fingers brushing the worn wood of the bedpost. The window looked out over the pasture, where the wind stirred the grass in long, soundless waves. He didn't unpack anything. Just sat down and waited for morning. The first snow came early that year, a thin crust of white across the high grass and fence rails, dusting the tops of the fence posts Ash had reset weeks before. The sky hung low and pale, a dull pewter that swallowed the sun. Florence stood in the doorway with her shawl clutched tight, watching as Lyle and Lee traced lines through the frost with their boots. Lyle showed her how to make a circle with a stick. She mimicked him, clumsy but proud, her mittened hands splayed for balance. Ash stepped out of the barn, arms full of chopped kindling. His breath clouded in front of him, and he walked stiffly, his shoulder had taken to aching in the cold. He caught Florence's eye and lifted his chin slightly in greeting, then disappeared around the corner to stack the wood. She followed a few minutes later, her boots crunching lightly behind him. "You favor your left side more when it's cold," she said, not quite a question. He straightened slowly. "Took a fall off a green bronc down near Fort Benton. Loosened something that never quite settled right. You ought to wrap it before you sleep. I have linen in the pantry." "I could do that," he said. She studied him, then pointed toward the barn roof. "Storm warped 2 shingles up there. Might not make it through the next thaw. I'll get up there tomorrow if it hasn't iced over." Florence didn't answer right away. A gust of wind pulled at her shawl and sent a feather of snow down her collar. She brushed at it absently. "Lee asked if you'd be here for Christmas." Ash lowered his gaze. "What did you say?" "I told her it depends whether you meant it what you said when you came." He nodded once. "I meant it." Florence crossed her arms, not to keep warm. "Then you'll need a coat. That threadbare thing you wear's barely fit for a fall wind, let alone sleet. It's held up all right so far. You're not just feeding chickens anymore, Ash." He looked at her fully then. "No. I'm not." Her eyes searched his face, and something softened in her, something brittle that had held tight these past weeks. Inside, Lee laughed, her voice high and brief. Florence glanced back toward the sound and stepped away. "You'll come in for supper tonight," she said without turning. "Lyle wants to show you something he made." Ash waited in the cold a moment longer before following her in. That evening, the house felt warmer than usual. Not from the stove alone, but from the quiet fullness that had crept in, slow and steady, like snow drift building in a windless hollow. Lyle stood at the table, holding something behind his back. "You ready?" he asked Ash, bouncing on his heels. "Let's see it." Lyle produced a small carved rabbit, the ears uneven and one leg longer than the rest, but the wood was smoothed with care and oiled lightly with bare grease from the pantry. "It's for Lee," Lyle said. "Because she always talks to the real ones out near the orchard like they're people." Ash took the carving in his hand, turning it slowly. "Looks like it could hop clean off the table." Lyle's face lit, but he tried to keep himself from grinning too wide. Florence watched them from the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. After the children had gone to bed, Ash lingered in the kitchen, drying the last of the crockery. Florence handed him a dishcloth without asking. "I used to think quiet like this meant something was missing," she said. Ash set a plate aside. "And now I think it means something settled." She didn't look at him when she said it, but her voice held a steadiness he hadn't heard in her before. He nodded, folding the cloth slowly. "I've been thinking about building a lean-to on the west side of the barn. For feed storage, less hauling in the cold." "Do it," she said. "We'll need it when the real snow comes." They stood in the kitchen a while longer, the stove ticking softly as it cooled. Florence touched the edge of the table with her fingertips. "Do you remember that night before you left?" she asked, her voice low. "When you said nothing and I said too much. I remember every word you said, and every one I didn't." She looked at him then, the lamplight catching the amber in her eyes. "I meant what I said that night. That love isn't something you wait to feel ready for, it's something you grow into." "I wasn't ready to grow into anything," he said, "but I wanted to be. And now, I've grown into it, Florence, into you, into this." He stepped closer, slow as dusk filling a room, and she didn't move away. Her breath caught, but not from fear. She reached up, touching the collar of his shirt where it had frayed from wear. "I never stopped loving you," she said. "I know," he answered, "and I've carried that with me every step." Outside, the wind sighed against the panes. Inside, the warmth held. Florence rested her forehead against his chest, her hands resting lightly against his ribs. Ash closed his arms around her, gentle and sure. They stood like that until the lamp burned low, and neither of them spoke again that night. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving everything silver and still. The lean-to took 6 days to raise. Ash built it slow, methodical, each board squared and braced proper. Florence watched from the window in the early hours, her hands busy with mending while Lee napped and Lyle practiced sums at the table. She didn't say much about the work, not even when he dug the posts in snow-hardened ground, but she kept hot food on the stove and left an oilskin on the peg by the door without comment. On the 7th morning, the roof shingles were fitted and the feed barrels moved beneath. Ash stood back and wiped his palms on his trousers, then turned to find Florence leaning against the barn wall, arms crossed, chin tilted. "You've a mind for structure," she said. "Years of sleeping under the sky'll teach a man to crave a roof that doesn't leak." She stepped toward the lean-to, ran a gloved hand along the edge of the new frame. "We can store the harnesses here, too. Keep them from stiffing up in the cold," Ash nodded. "Didn't figure you'd want them in the house anymore," her eyes flicked to him. "I stopped wanting things that didn't hold." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "You still want something that might," Florence didn't answer right away. There was a long wind-scoured silence between them, filled only by the rustle of pine needles and the distant crack of frozen branches. Then she said, "Lyle asked if you plan to take the Nolan name back to Wyoming come spring." "I told him I left that trail behind." She studied him, steady. "What name do you carry now, then?" "I've been thinking on that," he said. "Thinking maybe it's time I carried yours too, if you'd have me." Florence blinked, but her face didn't change. "You'd take Lark?" "I'd take whatever keeps me here." "With you?" She didn't move for a long breath, then stepped close enough to touch the front of his coat. "I was born on this land, tended it through blight, drought, and fire. I've buried kin here, and I've raised my children under its sky. If you take root here, you don't get to leave again." "I don't want to," he said, her hand rested on his chest. "Then you stay." That evening, Florence lit the parlor lamp while the children prepared for bed. Ash sat at the table, carving a new handle for the kitchen ladle Florence's had cracked along the grain. He looked up as she entered, her boots left by the door, shawl hung on its peg. "I wrote to the circuit preacher," she said. Ash set the carving aside. "You did? He'll be passing through next week. I asked if he might stop for a blessing." Ash stood. "You want a church wedding? I want one that lasts. Don't care if it's under a roof or sky, long as it's standing on truth." He crossed to her, took her hands in his. "Florence Lark, I've wandered half this country trying to outpace what I left behind. But nothing I found ever held near as strong as what I lost here. If you'll marry me under pine or porch, I'll build you a life as steady as I know how." Her eyes shone in the lamplight, not with tears, but something clearer. "Then we'll marry in the pasture." Under the cottonwoods. They stood there, hands joined, while the wind curled around corners and the fire burned down to coals. The preacher came on the 3rd day of thaw, his wagon rutted and his coat dusted with salt from the road. Florence wore a blue wool dress she'd sewn herself. and Lyle held Lee's hand tight while she scattered dried petals along the path from the house to the trees. The wedding was quiet, no guests but the land and the children. Ash stood tall beside her, his hair combed back, coat brushed neat, and said his vows with a voice sure as stone. Afterward, Florence served stew and cornbread inside the house, and Lee climbed into Ash's lap without waiting for permission. That night, with the children asleep and the fire low, Florence lay beside him, her head tucked beneath his chin. "You were gone a long time," she murmured. "I was," he said, kissing her hair, "but I came home." In the months that followed, the land softened. Florence planted beans early and set traps for moles near the orchard. Ash built a smokehouse behind the barn and started crafting toys from scrap wood when the chores slowed. Lyle asked if he might learn to ride bareback, and Ash said yes, but only once he could saddle blindfolded. Lee began humming lullabies in her sleep, and Florence found herself waking not with worry but peace. They did not speak of the past anymore. It had shaped them, but it no longer steered them. What they had now was built with quiet strength fence rails, warm bread, evening walks to the creek. No grand declarations, just the weight of a hand reaching for another and the knowing that it would always be met. And when the first fireflies came to the fields that summer, Ash took Florence's hand and led her beneath the cottonwoods, where they danced barefoot in the grass until the stars blinked down and the night closed gentle around them. They never left that land. Not once, and they never needed to.